February 12, 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. 24 U.S. Marine Corps Vought F4U Corsairs roll from the crushed coral runway. Pratt and Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp engines thunder at 2,000 horsepower. The goal is immediate: prove American aviation supremacy and erase the legend of the Japanese Zero. What happens next reshapes the entire Pacific Air War. The morning sun burned through the tropical haze as Major William Gise led his Marine Fighting Squadron 124 onto the most contested airfield in the Pacific. These were not ordinary fighter planes. The F4U Corsair represented the most radical departure in American fighter design, an inverted gull-wing configuration that married raw power to revolutionary aerodynamics. Each aircraft weighed 14,000 pounds fully loaded, powered by an 18-cylinder radial engine that generated more thrust than anything the Japanese had encountered. But power meant nothing without pilots who understood how to use it. The men of VMF 124 had averaged just 25 hours each in their new mounts. They were about to face an enemy who had perfected their tactics through 2 years of Pacific combat, flying aircraft they had mastered since the opening days of the war. The first mission was deceptively simple. 12 Corsairs would escort a PBY Catalina flying boat on a 230-mile rescue mission to Sandfly Bay on Vela La Vela. 2 Marine Wildcat pilots, First Lieutenant Jefferson DeBlanc and Staff Sergeant James Felleton, had ditched after combat and were waiting under the protection of Allied coastwatchers. The mission required a 500-mile round trip, pushing into Japanese-controlled airspace where enemy fighters could appear without warning. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh gripped the controls of his F4U as the formation climbed to 15,000 feet. The Corsair felt different from anything he had flown. The enormous engine torque wanted to roll the aircraft to the right on takeoff. The long nose blocked forward visibility, forcing pilots to weave during taxi. Most unsettling of all, the cockpit sat far aft on the fuselage, creating a sensation of riding in the tail of the airplane rather than commanding it from the front. Walsh was not a typical Marine aviator. He had enlisted as a private in 1933 and worked his way up through the ranks as an aircraft mechanic and radioman before earning his wings. At 26, he was older than most fighter pilots, with the methodical thinking of an enlisted man who had learned aviation from the ground up. He understood machinery in ways that college-trained officers sometimes did not. The rescue mission proceeded without incident. The PBY touched down in Sandfly Bay, collected the downed pilots, and returned safely to Henderson Field. But the operation revealed something crucial about the Corsair's capabilities. The aircraft had flown the entire distance without strain, carrying more fuel and covering greater ranges than the F4F Wildcats it was replacing. For the first time in the Pacific War, American fighters could escort bombers to targets that had been beyond their protective reach. The next day brought a different mission. 11 F4U Corsairs would escort 9 U.S. Navy PB-4Y-1 Liberator bombers to attack Japanese shipping in the Binshortland area of southern Bougainville. Intelligence indicated that enemy fighters would intercept, but the Americans were confident. The Corsair had proven its reliability. Now it needed to prove its combat effectiveness. At 25,000 feet over the Solomon Sea, the formation encountered its first glimpse of Japanese air power. A handful of Zero fighters circled at a distance, observing the American bombers and their escorts. The enemy pilots maintained their distance, studying the new gull-winged fighters with professional interest. They did not attack. They were gathering intelligence on American capabilities, reporting back to their squadrons on Bougainville and Rabaul. Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano watched the American formation through his binoculars from the cockpit of his A6M0. As squadron leader of the 204th Kokutai, Miyano was responsible for defending the airspace around Bougainville. He had already earned a reputation as one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most innovative tacticians, credited with developing the finger-4 formation that allowed fighter pilots to cover each other more effectively in combat. Miyano counted the American aircraft carefully. 9 heavy bombers with 11 escorts. The escort fighters were different from the stubby F4F Wildcats that Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to fighting. These new aircraft were larger, with distinctive bent wings and powerful engines. Their exhaust flames were brilliant blue, indicating high-octane fuel and significant power output. The Americans were introducing new equipment into the combat theater. The Japanese pilot did not attack that day. His orders were to observe and report, but he filed away every detail about the new American fighters for future reference. Their speed appeared comparable to the Zero at cruising power. Their formation discipline was adequate but not exceptional. Most importantly, they were operating at long range from their base, which meant they would have limited time over target before fuel considerations forced them to withdraw. The February 13th mission ended without combat. Both sides had taken each other's measure. The Americans returned to Henderson Field confident that their new fighters could handle whatever the Japanese sent against them. The Japanese prepared for the inevitable confrontation, assembling their forces for a coordinated response. February 14th, 1943, St. Valentine's Day. The date would become infamous in the annals of Pacific air combat, remembered not for romance but for a devastating demonstration of Japanese tactical superiority that shocked American airmen and forced a complete reevaluation of Corsair combat doctrine. The mission was a repeat of the previous day's operation. U.S. Navy PB-4Y Liberators would bomb Japanese shipping off southern Bougainville, escorted by 11 F4U Corsairs from VMF-124. The Americans expected light opposition based on the previous day's encounter. They were catastrophically wrong. Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Tomatsu Okabayashi was already airborne over southern Bougainville when the American formation appeared on the horizon. Leading a patrol of Zero fighters from the 252nd Kokutai, Okabayashi immediately radioed the sighting to Air Defense Headquarters at Kahili Airfield. Within minutes, the carefully coordinated Japanese response began. 13 Zero fighters from the 204th Kokutai scrambled from Bin Airfield, led by Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano. The American pilots watched dust clouds rise from the enemy runway as the interceptors climbed toward them. But the Japanese response was only beginning. 11 A6M-2N roof floatplane fighters from the 802nd Kokutai launched from their Shortland Islands base. Additional Zero fighters scrambled from Balale Airfield. Within 20 minutes, 41 Japanese fighters were converging on the American formation. The numerical odds were 3-1 against the Americans. But numbers alone did not explain what happened next. The Japanese had learned from 18 months of Pacific combat how to coordinate multiple squadrons in complex air battles. They had developed tactics for attacking heavily defended bomber formations. Most crucially, they had studied the performance characteristics of American fighters and knew how to exploit their weaknesses. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh felt his stomach tighten as he counted the enemy fighters climbing toward the American formation. This was not the handful of interceptors they had encountered the day before. This was a carefully orchestrated response designed to overwhelm the American escorts and destroy the bombers they were protecting. The Japanese attack began with textbook precision. Miyano's squadron climbed to attack altitude while maintaining formation discipline. Okabayashi's patrol positioned itself to cut off the Americans' escape route. The floatplane fighters spread wide to prevent the bombers from deviating from their planned flight path. Every move had been rehearsed in training and refined through combat experience. The first Japanese pilot to engage was Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Yoshio Yoshida of the 252nd Kokutai. Yoshida rolled his Zero into a diving attack on the American formation, targeting the lead Liberator bomber. First Lieutenant Gordon Lyon Jr., flying F4U tail number 17786, turned to intercept the attacking Zero. What happened next demonstrated the fundamental challenge facing American pilots transitioning to the Corsair. The aircraft was faster than the Zero in level flight and could outclimb it at high speeds. But Lyon attempted to turn with the Japanese fighter at low speed, where the Zero's superior maneuverability gave it a decisive advantage. The two fighters collided head-on at 8,000 feet. Both pilots were killed instantly. It was the first confirmed kill by an F4U Corsair, but it had cost an American pilot his life. The collision triggered a massive dogfight that scattered across 50 square miles of sky. Japanese pilots demonstrated their superior numbers and tactical coordination, attacking the American formation from multiple directions simultaneously. The Corsair pilots found themselves fighting individual battles against multiple opponents, unable to maintain mutual support. First Lieutenant Harold Stewart, flying F4U tail number 17749, found himself pursued by 30 fighters as he attempted to protect the bombers. The Japanese pilots took turns attacking, preventing Stewart from gaining altitude or building speed where his aircraft's superior performance could give him an advantage. His Corsair absorbed multiple 20mm cannon hits before catching fire. Stewart bailed out at 4,000 feet and was never seen again. The P-38 Lightning fighters that had joined the mission as additional escort fared even worse. For Lightnings were shot down by the coordinated Japanese attack, their twin engines making them conspicuous targets for enemy fighters. The few American pilots who survived the initial engagement found themselves outnumbered and separated from their formation. The PB-4Y Liberator bombers pressed on to their target despite the air battle raging around them. Two of the heavy bombers were shot down by Japanese fighters, their crews lost in the waters off Bougainville. The surviving bombers dropped their ordnance and claimed hits on Japanese shipping, but only one vessel, the 6,500-ton merchantman Hitachi Maru, was actually sunk. When the battle ended, American losses were staggering. 9 U.S. aircraft had been destroyed, 4 P-38 Lightnings, 2 F4U Corsairs, 2 PB-4Y Liberators, and 1 additional fighter. Against these losses, the Japanese had suffered exactly one casualty. Flight Petty Officer Yoshida, who had died in the collision with Lieutenant Lyon's Corsair. The mission became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and its impact on American morale was devastating. The F4U Corsair, which had been hailed as America's answer to Japanese air superiority, had been outfought by an enemy using tactics and aircraft that were supposedly obsolete. The Zero, which American intelligence had dismissed as fragile and outdated, had demonstrated that in the hands of experienced pilots it remained a formidable opponent. The surviving pilots of VMF-124 returned to Henderson Field shaken by their experience. The Japanese had demonstrated tactical coordination that the Americans had not expected. Their pilots had shown discipline and skill that contradicted intelligence reports describing declining enemy capabilities. Most disturbing of all, the encounter had revealed fundamental gaps in American understanding of how to employ the Corsair effectively in combat. Major William Gise convened an immediate debrief with his surviving pilots. The lessons were harsh but necessary. The Corsair could not turn with a Zero at low speeds. American pilots who attempted traditional dogfighting tactics against Japanese fighters would be shot down. The aircraft's superior speed and climb rate were meaningless unless pilots learned to use altitude and energy management to dictate the terms of engagement. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh absorbed these lessons with the methodical attention of a former mechanic studying a complex machine. The Corsair was not a better Wildcat. It was an entirely different type of fighter that required new tactics and new thinking. American pilots would need to unlearn years of training and develop combat techniques that matched the aircraft's unique capabilities. The psychological impact of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre extended far beyond VMF-124. American bomber crews began requesting larger fighter escorts for missions over Bougainville. Air commanders postponed daylight raids until American fighter tactics could be improved. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese air power had delivered a decisive tactical victory that forced changes in American operational planning. Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano returned to his base at Bin knowing that his squadron had achieved something significant. The coordinated attack had destroyed 9 American aircraft while losing only 1 Japanese fighter. More importantly, the action had demonstrated that Japanese pilots retained their tactical edge despite fighting with supposedly inferior equipment. Miyano filed a detailed after-action report that would influence Japanese fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war. The new American fighters were fast and well-armed, but their pilots lacked experience in coordinated air combat. Japanese squadrons that maintained formation discipline and executed coordinated attacks could overwhelm American escorts even when outnumbered. The key was to force the Americans into low-speed turning fights where Japanese aircraft retained their traditional advantages. The 204th Kokutai had expended significant ammunition during the engagement. Miyano's squadron alone had fired 5,126 rounds of 7.7mm ammunition and 1,369 rounds of 20mm cannon shells. The expenditure reflected the intensity of the combat and the determination of Japanese pilots to press their attacks home despite heavy defensive fire. But the Japanese success came at a cost that was not immediately apparent. The coordinated defense of Bougainville had required the participation of multiple squadrons, stripping fighters from other sectors. Japanese air commanders were forced to concentrate their remaining experienced pilots in critical areas, leaving other fronts vulnerable to American attack. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force was entering a period where tactical victories could not compensate for strategic weakness. The weeks following the St. Valentine's Day massacre were a period of intense learning for American fighter pilots. VMF-124 received new aircraft to replace those lost in combat, but more importantly, the squadron received new tactical guidance from air commanders who had studied the action reports. The key insight was altitude. The F4U Corsair could climb at 4,360 feet per minute, significantly faster than any Japanese fighter. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the Corsair's turbo-supercharged engine maintained power, while Japanese fighters struggled in the thin air. American pilots who maintained altitude advantage could dictate when and how to engage enemy aircraft. Kenneth Walsh became the test pilot for these new tactics. On April 1, 1943, he encountered a Japanese patrol while flying at 25,000 feet over the Russell Islands. Instead of diving immediately to attack, Walsh used his altitude to study the enemy formation and select the most advantageous approach. When he finally attacked, it was from above and behind, using the Corsair's superior speed to engage and disengage at will. Walsh's first attack destroyed an Aichi D-3, a Val dive bomber, with a single burst from his 650 caliber machine guns. The Japanese pilot never saw the attack coming. Walsh used his excess speed to climb back to altitude, then selected a second target from the confused enemy formation. Two A-6M0 fighters attempted to intercept him, but the American pilot used his aircraft's superior climb rate to stay above them. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. Walsh destroyed 2 additional Japanese fighters and damaged a third before the surviving enemy aircraft withdrew. He had achieved the first successful demonstration of energy tactics in the Pacific theater, proving that American pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities could defeat Japanese fighters despite their numerical and tactical advantages. Word of Walsh's success spread quickly through the Marine squadrons based in the Solomons. Pilots began experimenting with high-altitude approaches and energy management techniques. The traditional Navy doctrine of turning dogfights was replaced by hit-and-run tactics that exploited the Corsair's superior speed and climb rate. The tactical evolution was not without casualties. Several pilots were shot down attempting to master the new techniques. The Corsair demanded more skill and judgment than the forgiving F4F Wildcat it replaced. Pilots who made errors in energy management found themselves slow and vulnerable, easy targets for experienced Japanese fighters. But gradually, American combat effectiveness began to improve. By May 1943, VMF-124 pilots were consistently achieving favorable exchange rates against Japanese fighters. The squadron's kill-to-loss ratio improved from the disastrous 9-to-1 deficit of St. Valentine's Day to near parity, then to American advantage. Kenneth Walsh epitomized this improvement. On May 13th, he shot down 3 Zero fighters in a single engagement, becoming the first Corsair pilot to achieve ace status. His tactics were studied and copied by other pilots throughout the Pacific theater. The methodical former mechanic had become the leading advocate for scientific fighter tactics based on aircraft performance rather than pilot bravado. The Japanese response to improving American tactics was to increase the training and experience level of their own pilots. Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano continued to refine Japanese fighter doctrine, emphasizing coordination and mutual support between aircraft. Japanese squadrons began operating in larger formations, using numerical superiority to offset American technological advantages. But the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a fundamental problem that no amount of tactical innovation could solve. American industrial production was beginning to overwhelm Japanese manufacturing capacity. For every F4U Corsair shot down, 3 more rolled off production lines in Connecticut and New York. For every trained American pilot killed in action, 5 more completed training in Florida and Texas. Japanese pilot training programs, by contrast, were being shortened to meet operational demands. The comprehensive 18-month curriculum that had produced the expert pilots who dominated early Pacific combat was reduced to 6 months. Then 4. New Japanese pilots arriving in combat theaters lacked the experience and skill level of their predecessors, making them vulnerable to American fighters flown by increasingly experienced pilots. The contrast was evident in combat effectiveness. Veteran Japanese pilots like Miyano continued to achieve impressive kill ratios against American aircraft. But their newer squadron mates struggled against F4U pilots who had learned to exploit their aircraft's performance advantages. Japanese formations that had once operated with perfect coordination began showing signs of inexperience and hesitation. Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano recognized the deteriorating situation but was powerless to address its root causes. The 204th Kokutai was receiving replacement pilots who had barely mastered basic flying skills, much less the complex tactics required for successful fighter combat. Miyano found himself training new pilots in combat conditions, a dangerous necessity that reduced overall squadron effectiveness. The turning point came on June 16, 1943, during a large-scale air battle over the Russell Islands. Miyano was leading a formation of 12-0 fighters against a mixed force of American F4U Corsairs and F6F Hellcats. The Japanese pilot had planned a coordinated attack using proven tactics that had succeeded in previous engagements. But half of Miyano's pilots were recent replacements with less than 50 hours of combat experience. When the American fighters executed a climbing turn that brought them above the Japanese formation, the inexperienced pilots broke formation and attempted individual attacks. The careful coordination that was essential to Japanese tactical success disintegrated into a chaotic melee. Kenneth Walsh was leading the American formation that day, flying as part of an experimental mixed squadron of Corsairs and Hellcats. He recognized immediately that the Japanese formation had lost cohesion and ordered his pilots to exploit the tactical advantage. American fighters dove on isolated Japanese aircraft, using their superior speed and firepower to achieve quick kills before climbing back to altitude. The engagement lasted 30 minutes and resulted in 8 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 2 American losses. More importantly, one of the Japanese casualties was Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano, killed when his Zero was caught in a climbing turn by 2 F6F Hellcats. The loss of one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most innovative tacticians was a blow from which Japanese fighter squadrons in the Solomon Islands never fully recovered. Miyano's death marked the end of Japanese tactical superiority in the Pacific Air War. The remaining veteran pilots were increasingly outnumbered by inexperienced replacements who lacked the skill to execute complex coordinated attacks. Japanese formations began avoiding contact with American fighters unless they held overwhelming numerical advantage. The impact was immediately felt in bombing operations. American B-24 and B-25 bombers began reaching targets that had been heavily defended just months earlier. Japanese shipping moved only at night to avoid daylight air attacks. The carefully constructed air defense system that had protected Japanese bases throughout the Solomon Islands began to collapse. Kenneth Walsh's success continued through the summer of 1943. By August, he had achieved 20 confirmed victories and was recognized as the most successful F4U pilot in the Pacific theater. His tactics had been adopted by Marine squadrons throughout the combat zone, contributing to American air superiority that would prove decisive in subsequent operations. On August 15, 1943, Walsh demonstrated the full potential of properly employed F4U tactics in an engagement that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Flying as part of a 4-aircraft patrol over Vella La Vella, Walsh encountered a Japanese formation of 24 aircraft preparing to bomb Allied ground forces and shipping. The odds were 6-1 against the American patrol, but Walsh had learned to think in terms of energy and altitude rather than numerical strength. The Japanese formation was flying at 15,000 feet, loaded with bombs and committed to a specific target. Walsh's patrol was at 25,000 feet with full fuel and ammunition loads. Walsh led his formation in a diving attack that used their altitude advantage to build speed for the engagement. His first target was a formation of Aichi D-3A dive bombers that were particularly vulnerable due to their bomb loads and limited defensive armament. Walsh's initial attack destroyed 2 dive bombers and scattered their escorts. The Japanese fighter escort, consisting of a 6M0 fighters, attempted to intercept the American attack. But Walsh had planned his approach to use the Corsair's superior speed for hit-and-run tactics rather than sustained combat. After his first pass, he used his excess speed to climb back above the Japanese formation and select another target. Walsh's second attack focused on the Japanese fighter escort. His F4U had been hit several times by defensive fire, including a 20mm shell that punctured his starboard wing fuel tank. But the aircraft's rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would have destroyed a lighter fighter. Walsh pressed his attack and destroyed one Zero fighter before withdrawing. The engagement demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the F4U in combat. When properly employed by an experienced pilot with tactical advantages, the Corsair was devastatingly effective. But it required careful planning and precise execution to achieve success against determined opposition. Walsh's aircraft was declared a total loss when he returned to base, but his tactical success influenced American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war. The engagement proved that single American fighters could successfully attack much larger Japanese formations when they held altitude and energy advantages. 2 weeks later, on August 30th, Walsh would exceed even this performance in an action that demonstrated both his personal skill and the evolution of American fighter tactics over 6 months of intensive combat. The mission began as a routine bomber escort. Walsh was leading a formation of F4U Corsairs protecting B-24 Liberators attacking Japanese installations at Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. The bombers had completed their attack and were withdrawing when Walsh's engine began running rough due to mechanical problems. Standard procedure required Walsh to return to base immediately for repairs. But the formation was still in hostile airspace where Japanese fighters could intercept the bombers during their withdrawal. Walsh made the decision to land at the advanced airfield at Munda, recently captured from Japanese forces, to obtain a replacement aircraft. The landing at Munda took precious time that separated Walsh from his squadron. When he took off in a borrowed F4U, his formation was already 20 miles ahead and approaching the limit of fighter escort range. Walsh pushed his replacement aircraft to maximum speed, hoping to catch up before Japanese fighters could intercept the unescorted bombers. At 15,000 feet over the slot, Walsh encountered approximately 50 Japanese Zero fighters from multiple squadrons converging on the American bomber formation. The odds were 50-1 against the single American fighter. Any rational tactical analysis would have suggested withdrawal to seek reinforcements or radio for additional support. Instead, Walsh attacked immediately. His decision was based on calculated assessment of the tactical situation rather than reckless heroism. The Japanese fighters were focused on intercepting the bombers and not expecting attack from behind. Walsh could achieve surprise and potentially disrupt their coordinated assault before they realized he was there. Walsh's first attack came from above and behind the Japanese formation. His 650 caliber machine guns concentrated their fire on a single Zero fighter, destroying it before the pilot could react. The surviving Japanese fighters scattered, confused by the unexpected attack and uncertain about the number of American aircraft involved. Walsh used the confusion to climb back to altitude and assess the situation. The Japanese formation had broken up, with individual pilots seeking the source of the attack. This played directly to American tactical advantages, transforming a coordinated enemy assault into a series of individual dogfights where superior aircraft performance could prove decisive. The engagement that followed lasted 45 minutes and demonstrated every lesson Walsh had learned about energy management and tactical patience. He destroyed 3 additional Zero fighters while avoiding sustained combat that could have allowed Japanese numerical superiority to overwhelm him. Each attack was carefully planned to maximize his aircraft's advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Walsh's tactics during the August 30th engagement became the template for American fighter operations throughout the Pacific. He proved that a single well-flown F4U could successfully engage much larger enemy formations by using altitude, speed, and careful target selection. The action saved the bomber formation from destruction and demonstrated the evolution of American air combat effectiveness. When Walsh finally landed back at his home base, his aircraft showed evidence of the intense combat. 20mm cannon shells had punctured his wings and fuselage. His engine was running rough from sustained operation at maximum power. but he had achieved 4 confirmed victories against one of the largest Japanese fighter formations encountered in the Solomon Islands campaign. The Medal of Honor citation for Walsh's actions on August 15th and 30th summarized the transformation of American fighter tactics in the Pacific. Extraordinary heroism and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty as a pilot in Marine Fighting Squadron 124 in aerial combat against enemy Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands area. More importantly, Walsh's success demonstrated that American pilots had learned to exploit their aircraft's superior performance characteristics. The early disasters like the St. Valentine's Day massacre had been painful but educational experiences that forced tactical innovation and improved training. By late 1943, American fighter pilots were achieving kill ratios that exceeded 11-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. The 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by F4U Corsair pilots was not the result of superior individual pilot skill, though American training programs were producing increasingly capable aviators. The ratio reflected the combined impact of superior aircraft performance, improved tactics, better training, and American industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Japanese air commanders recognized the deteriorating situation but lacked the resources to address it effectively. Experienced pilots like Lieutenant Maiano were being killed faster than they could be replaced. New pilots arriving in combat theaters lacked the training time necessary to master complex fighter tactics. Most critically, Japanese aircraft production was falling behind American manufacturing capacity. The Mitsubishi A6M0 that had dominated early Pacific combat was showing its age by late 1943. The aircraft's light construction, which had given it superior range and maneuverability, made it vulnerable to the heavy defensive armament carried by American fighters and bombers. Japanese pilots found that their traditional advantages in dogfighting were being neutralized by American tactical improvements. Efforts to develop improved Japanese fighters were hampered by resource constraints and competing priorities. The Kawanishi N1K, J. George, and Mitsubishi J2M Jack showed promise in testing, but production delays and quality control problems prevented their deployment in sufficient numbers to affect the air war's outcome. Meanwhile, American fighter development was accelerating. The F4U 1D model introduced in late 1943 incorporated lessons learned from combat experience. Improved visibility, better armor protection, and provision for ground attack ordnance made the Corsair even more versatile and effective. The F4U 4 model, introduced in 1944, would push performance even higher with a more powerful R2818W engine producing 2,380 horsepower. But perhaps the most significant factor in American success was the systematic approach to training and tactics development. Combat reports from pilots like Kenneth Walsh were analyzed by training commands and incorporated into curricula for new pilots. Lessons learned in the Solomon Islands were transmitted to training bases in the United States, ensuring that replacement pilots arrived in combat theaters with knowledge purchased by their predecessors' blood. The contrast with Japanese training methods was stark. Japanese pilot education had traditionally emphasized individual skill and spiritual preparation over systematic tactical analysis. While this approach had produced exceptional individual pilots, it was less effective at transmitting complex tactical knowledge to large numbers of replacement aviators. By early 1944, the transformation of Pacific air combat was complete. American fighter squadrons that had struggled to survive in early 1943 were achieving overwhelming tactical superiority. Japanese formations that had once dominated Pacific skies were reduced to defensive operations and night attacks to avoid contact with superior American forces. The F4U Corsair played a central role in this transformation, but it was not the only factor. The aircraft's superior performance provided American pilots with tactical options that had not existed earlier in the war. But realizing those advantages required new thinking, improved training, and battlefield experience that came at significant cost in aircraft and lives. Kenneth Walsh's evolution from struggling novice to Medal of Honor recipient exemplified the learning curve that American aviation traversed between February and August 1943. His early experiences in the St. Valentine's Day massacre taught him that traditional fighter tactics were inadequate against experienced Japanese pilots. His later successes demonstrated that American pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities could achieve decisive tactical advantages. The British Royal Navy's experience with the F4U Corsair provided an interesting counterpoint to American tactical development. British pilots, operating from aircraft carriers in both European and Pacific theaters, faced different challenges that required different solutions. The Royal Navy received 2012 F4U Corsairs under Lend-Lease beginning in 1943. These aircraft, designated Corsair F Mark I through Mark IV in British service, were modified to operate from smaller British aircraft carriers. Wing tips were clipped by 8 inches to fit in lower hangars, and the canopy was bulged to improve pilot visibility during carrier operations. British pilots developed innovative techniques to overcome the Corsair's notorious carrier landing difficulties. Instead of flying straight approaches that limited forward visibility, Royal Navy pilots used curving approaches that allowed them to see the flight deck and landing signals officer until the final moment before touchdown. This technique, combined with improved pilot training, made the Corsair an effective carrier fighter for the Fleet Air Arm. British Corsairs first saw action in European waters during Operation Tungsten, the April 1944 attack on the German battleship Tirpitz anchored in a Norwegian fjord. Corsairs from HMS Victorious and HMS Formidable provided fighter cover for the attacking force, demonstrating the aircraft's versatility in different combat environments. The Royal Navy's success with carrier operations had implications for American naval aviation. U.S. Navy officials had initially rejected the F4U for carrier use due to landing difficulties, preferring the more docile F6F Hellcat for shipboard operations. But British success with modified techniques and improved pilot training led to reconsideration of this decision. By early 1944, American carrier squadrons were beginning to receive F4U aircraft for operational trials. The first U.S. Navy carrier squadron to operate Corsairs was VF-17, which flew from USS Bunker Hill during attacks on Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands. The squadron's success led to expanded Corsair deployment aboard American carriers throughout 1944 and 1945. The transition to carrier operations opened new tactical possibilities for F4U employment. Carrier-based Corsairs could provide fighter cover for amphibious operations without requiring the construction of shore-based airfields. This flexibility proved crucial during the rapid advance across the Central Pacific that characterized American strategy in the war's final years. Marine Corsair squadrons continued to operate from shore bases throughout the Pacific Campaign, but their role evolved from pure air superiority to multi-mission operations that included ground attack and close air support. The F4U's ability to carry significant ordnance loads while maintaining fighter performance made it ideal for supporting amphibious landings and ground operations. The versatility of the Corsair was demonstrated during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, where Marine and Navy F4U squadrons flew multiple mission types simultaneously. Fighter patrols defended the invasion fleet against kamikaze attacks while ground attack missions supported troops ashore. The same aircraft that had struggled to survive its first combat encounters 2 years earlier had become the backbone of American tactical aviation in the Pacific. Kenneth Walsh returned to combat in April 1945 as part of VMF 222, flying the improved F4U-4 model from bases in the Philippines and later Okinawa. His second combat tour demonstrated how much both the aircraft and American tactics had evolved since the desperate days of early 1943. The F4U-4 incorporated lessons learned from 2 years of combat experience. A more powerful R2818W engine increased maximum speed to 446 miles per hour. An improved 4-bladed propeller enhanced climb performance to 4,360 feet per minute. Better armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks increased survivability against enemy fire. But the most significant improvement was in pilot training and tactical doctrine. Replacement pilots arriving in combat theaters in 1945 had trained on aircraft identical to those they would fly in combat. They had learned energy management and altitude tactics from instructors who were veterans of earlier Pacific campaigns. Most importantly, they joined squadrons with established tactical procedures and experienced leaders who could guide their integration into combat operations. Walsh's final air-to-air victory came on June 22, 1945, when he intercepted a Japanese kamikaze attack against American shipping off Okinawa. The engagement demonstrated both the evolution of the air war and the continuing effectiveness of properly employed F4U tactics. The Japanese kamikaze pilot was flying an A6M0 configured for a one-way suicide mission. The aircraft carried a 500-pound bomb and enough fuel for a single attack run against American ships. The pilot was trained for one mission: to crash his aircraft into an enemy vessel regardless of defensive fire or fighter interception. Walsh's interception was textbook perfect, demonstrating 2 years of tactical refinement and combat experience. He approached from above and behind, using the sun to mask his approach until the final moments before attack. His first burst from 650 caliber machine guns destroyed the kamikaze aircraft before it could reach the American fleet. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, but it represented the culmination of American tactical development in the Pacific War. A single F4U pilot had neutralized an enemy attack that could have sunk an American warship and killed hundreds of sailors. The aircraft and pilot that had struggled to survive their first encounters with Japanese fighters had evolved into the dominant force in Pacific skies. Walsh's 21st and final victory brought his total to 21 confirmed aerial kills, making him the fourth highest-scoring Marine Corps ace of World War II. 17 of his victories were against A6M0 fighters, demonstrating his mastery of the tactical techniques necessary to defeat Japan's most numerous fighter aircraft. The statistical record of F4U Corsair operations in World War II tells the story of American tactical evolution in stark numbers. Between February 1943 and August 1945, Corsair pilots flew 64,000 combat sorties in the Pacific theater. They achieved 2,140 confirmed aerial victories against 189 aircraft lost in air-to-air combat. The 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Corsair pilots was unprecedented in military aviation history. No previous fighter aircraft had achieved such decisive tactical superiority over extended combat operations. The ratio reflected not just superior aircraft performance, but systematic improvements in training, tactics, and logistical support that characterized American military operations in the Pacific War. Japanese records provide a different perspective on the air war's evolution, but they confirm the effectiveness of American tactical improvements. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force units that had achieved favorable exchange rates against F4F Wildcats and P-40 Warhawks found themselves increasingly outmatched by F4U Corsairs flown by experienced American pilots. The 204th Kokutai, which had achieved such success during the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, was disbanded in January 1944 after suffering unsustainable losses. The squadron that had once claimed nearly 1,000 aerial victories was reduced to fewer than 6 operational aircraft by sustained combat against improving American air defenses. Similar patterns affected Japanese air units throughout the Pacific theater. Squadrons that had dominated early Pacific combat were systematically destroyed by American fighter pilots who had learned to exploit their aircraft's superior performance characteristics. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carefully trained cadre of expert pilots was irreplaceably depleted by combat losses that Japanese training programs could not make good. By late 1944, Japanese air operations in the Pacific were reduced to kamikaze attacks that reflected desperation rather than tactical innovation. The coordinated fighter formations that had once contested American air superiority were replaced by individual suicide pilots flying one-way missions against American shipping. The F4U Corsair's role in this transformation cannot be separated from broader American advantages in industrial production, pilot training, and logistical support. But the aircraft provided American pilots with performance margins that made tactical innovation possible. The superior speed, climb rate, and armament of the Corsair created options that had not existed with earlier American fighters. More importantly, the Corsair's rugged construction allowed pilots to survive the learning process that transformed American fighter tactics. Aircraft that could absorb significant battle damage and return to base enabled pilots like Kenneth Walsh to accumulate the combat experience necessary to develop effective techniques against Japanese opposition. The contrast with Japanese aircraft development reflects different national approaches to military aviation. American designers emphasized performance, firepower, and survivability even at the cost of increased weight and complexity. Japanese designers prioritized range, maneuverability, and production efficiency, accepting reduced survivability as a necessary trade-off. These design philosophies produced aircraft that reflected their nation's strategic situations. Japan, fighting a defensive war across vast Pacific distances with limited industrial capacity, required aircraft that could operate from widely dispersed bases with minimal logistical support. The A6M0's exceptional range and simplicity made it ideal for these conditions, but its light construction made it vulnerable as the war's intensity increased. America, with massive industrial capacity and secure bases, could afford to build heavier, more complex aircraft that required extensive logistical support. The F4U Corsair's sophisticated systems and heavy armament would have been impossible to maintain in forward combat areas without American logistical capabilities, but these characteristics provided decisive tactical advantages when properly supported. The 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Corsair pilots was thus not simply a measure of aircraft performance, but a reflection of systemic American advantages that became more pronounced as the war continued. Superior industrial production provided numerical advantages that Japanese pilots could not overcome through individual skill or tactical innovation. American training programs, protected by geographic isolation from enemy attack, could develop and refine instructional methods based on combat experience transmitted from operational theaters. Japanese training programs, conducted under increasing pressure from American strategic bombing, were forced to reduce training time and eliminate advanced courses that had produced expert pilots in the war's early years. The logistical comparison was even more stark. American aircraft in combat theaters were supported by supply chains that could provide replacement parts, new engines, and upgraded equipment without interruption. Japanese aircraft often operated with improvised repairs and reduced maintenance schedules that degraded performance and reliability. By 1945, these accumulated advantages had created a situation where individual Japanese pilots, regardless of their skill and determination, faced overwhelming odds in combat against American aviation. The F4U Corsair pilots who achieved the 11-to-1 kill ratio were operating within a system that maximized their individual capabilities while minimizing risks and losses. Kenneth Walsh's post-war career reflected the broader transformation of American military aviation during World War II. He continued flying with the Marine Corps through the Korean War, commanding transport squadrons and serving in staff positions that drew upon his combat experience and tactical knowledge. Walsh's evolution from enlisted mechanic to Medal of Honor recipient and senior officer exemplified the democratization of American aviation that occurred during the war years. Traditional barriers between enlisted personnel and commissioned officers were reduced by the urgent need for experienced aviators. Combat performance became more important than social background in determining advancement and responsibility. The lessons learned by pilots like Walsh during the Pacific Campaign influenced American fighter development and training programs for decades. The tactical principles of energy management, altitude advantage, and systematic approach to air combat became fundamental elements of Air Force and Navy pilot training. The F4U Corsair's combat record provided validation for design approaches that emphasize performance and survivability over traditional measures of fighter capability. Modern air combat systems trace their conceptual origins to innovations developed during the Pacific War. The integration of radar, communications, and coordinated tactics that characterizes contemporary air operations began with pilots like Walsh learning to use their aircraft's capabilities systematically rather than relying on individual skill and initiative. The F4U Corsair continued in production until 1953, with total production reaching 12,571 aircraft. Post-war variants incorporated jet-age technologies including improved avionics, better weapon systems, and enhanced performance characteristics. French naval aviation operated Corsairs until 1964, making it one of the longest-serving fighter designs in military history. But the aircraft's most significant legacy was proving that systematic analysis and technological innovation could overcome traditional military advantages based on experience and tactical skill. The 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Corsair pilots established a new standard for air combat effectiveness that influenced fighter design and tactics development throughout the Cold War era. The Japanese perspective on the F4U Corsair's impact reveals the profound psychological effects of American tactical innovation. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force veterans who survived the war consistently identified the introduction of the Corsair as a turning point that fundamentally altered the character of Pacific air combat. Captain Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator who served throughout the Pacific War, wrote in his post-war memoir that American fighter tactics evolved more rapidly than Japanese commanders had anticipated. The early success achieved during actions like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre had created overconfidence that proved costly when American pilots adapted to their aircraft's capabilities. Okumia noted that Japanese training programs had emphasized individual pilot skill and spiritual preparation, approaches that proved inadequate against systematic American tactical development. Japanese pilots who achieved early success often became overconfident and failed to adapt when American capabilities improved. This contrasted with American pilots like Kenneth Walsh, who continuously refined their techniques based on combat experience and technical analysis. The Japanese naval aviator observed that American industrial capacity allowed for tactical experimentation that was impossible within the Imperial Japanese Navy's resource constraints. American pilots could afford to test new techniques knowing that losses would be replaced quickly. Japanese pilots, aware that every aircraft lost was irreplaceable, became increasingly conservative in their tactics. This tactical conservatism, according to Okumia, contributed to the decline in Japanese air combat effectiveness that became pronounced by late 1943. Experienced pilots who might have developed innovative responses to American tactical improvements were instead focused on preservation of scarce resources, limiting their ability to take the risks necessary for tactical innovation. The psychological impact of the F4U Corsair extended beyond its direct combat effectiveness. Japanese pilots began avoiding contact with American fighters whenever possible, reducing their opportunities to gain combat experience and develop new tactics. This created a negative feedback loop where declining pilot quality led to increased losses, which further reduced the number of experienced aviators available for training and tactical development. By 1944, Japanese air units were experiencing what modern military analysts would recognize as a death spiral of declining effectiveness. Units that had once contested American air operations were reduced to defensive actions designed to preserve aircraft and pilots rather than achieve tactical objectives. The initiative in Pacific air combat had passed permanently to American forces. The technological comparison between the F4U Corsair and contemporary Japanese fighters illustrates the different approaches to aircraft design that characterized American and Japanese aviation industries. The Corsair's Pratt and Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, making it one of the most powerful aircraft engines in production during the war years. This engine, combined with the Corsair's sophisticated turbo supercharger system, maintained high power output at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled with reduced performance. The aircraft's maximum speed of 446 miles per hour at 26,000 feet compared favorably with any contemporary fighter, while its service ceiling of 41,500 feet provided altitude advantages that proved decisive in combat. The Corsair's armament of 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower against lightly constructed Japanese aircraft. Each gun fired at 850 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire that could destroy enemy aircraft with short bursts. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition used by American fighters was particularly effective against Japanese aircraft that lacked adequate armor protection. Japanese fighters like the A6M0, by contrast, typically carried 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. While the cannons provided excellent hitting power, their low rate of fire and limited ammunition capacity made them less effective than the concentrated machine gun armament of American fighters. Japanese pilots needed to achieve precise hits to inflict critical damage, while American pilots could destroy targets with volume of fire. The structural comparison was equally revealing. The F4U Corsair incorporated armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant control systems that enhanced survivability in combat. These features added weight and complexity but enabled pilots to survive damage that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft. Japanese fighters sacrificed survivability for range and maneuverability, characteristics that had proven valuable in the war's early years when Japanese pilots held qualitative advantages. But as American pilot training improved and tactical innovations reduced the importance of traditional dogfighting skills, the fragility of Japanese aircraft became a critical weakness. The production comparison reflected broader differences in national industrial capacity. Chance Vought Corporation manufactured 4,696 F4U Corsairs during the war years, while Goodyear Aircraft produced 4,014 FG variants and Brewster Aeronautical Corporation built 735 F-3A models. Total American production exceeded 12,000 aircraft from multiple production lines. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, by contrast, produced 10,449 A6M0 fighters during the entire war, despite the aircraft's simpler construction and lower material requirements. Japanese industrial capacity was increasingly diverted to other military priorities as the war progressed, reducing aircraft production at precisely the moment when replacement needs were highest. The training comparison provides perhaps the most telling illustration of systemic differences between American and Japanese aviation programs. American pilot training expanded throughout the war years, with multiple training bases producing thousands of new aviators annually. Training aircraft, fuel, and instructors were available in quantities that allowed for comprehensive preparation before assignment to combat units. Japanese pilot training programs, by contrast, were progressively shortened as operational demands increased. The 18-month curriculum that had produced expert pilots in 1941 was reduced to 12 months by 1942, 9 months by 1943, and 6 months by 1944. Advanced training in gunnery, tactics, and instrument flying was eliminated to accelerate production of replacement pilots. The qualitative difference was apparent in combat performance. American replacement pilots arriving in combat theaters by 1944 had typically accumulated more than 300 hours of flight time, including advanced training in the specific aircraft they would fly operationally. Japanese replacement pilots often arrived with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time and minimal training in combat techniques. This training disparity contributed directly to the 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by F4U Corsair pilots. American pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities and had trained extensively in combat techniques consistently defeated Japanese opponents who lacked comparable preparation. The technological advantages of the Corsair were magnified by superior pilot preparation and tactical knowledge. The logistics comparison reveals additional systematic advantages that contributed to American success. F4U Corsairs operating in combat theaters were supported by supply chains that provided regular maintenance, replacement parts, and upgraded equipment. American aircraft could be maintained at optimal performance levels throughout their operational lives. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, often operated with deferred maintenance and improvised repairs as spare parts became increasingly scarce. Performance degradation due to worn engines, damaged propellers, and jury-rigged systems reduced the combat effectiveness of aircraft that were already technologically inferior to their American opponents. The combined effect of these systematic advantages created a situation where individual Japanese pilots, regardless of their skill and determination, faced overwhelming odds in combat against American aviation. The F4U Corsair's 11-to-1 kill ratio reflected not just superior aircraft design, but comprehensive American advantages in training, logistics, production, and tactical development. The psychological impact on Japanese aviation extended beyond combat losses to include broader effects on morale and strategic planning. Japanese commanders who had planned operations based on assumptions of air superiority were forced to revise their expectations as American fighter performance improved. The Imperial Japanese Navy's strategic doctrine, which depended on controlling sea areas through land-based aviation, became untenable as American fighters achieved decisive tactical advantages. By 1945, Japanese air operations were characterized by desperation rather than strategic coherence. Kamikaze attacks represented an acknowledgement that conventional air combat had become hopeless for Japanese aviation. The coordinated fighter formations that had once contested American air superiority were replaced by individual suicide missions that reflected the collapse of Japanese tactical aviation. The F4U Corsair's role in this transformation extended beyond its direct combat effectiveness to include broader contributions to American strategic success. The aircraft's versatility in fighter bomber, and close air support roles provided American commanders with tactical flexibility that Japanese forces could not match. Operations that required coordination between different aircraft types could be accomplished by single squadrons of multi-role Corsairs. This operational flexibility became increasingly important as American strategy evolved from defensive operations to offensive campaigns across the Central Pacific. Amphibious landings required simultaneous air superiority, ground attack, and close air support missions that could be provided by carrier-based F4U squadrons without requiring the construction of shore-based airfields. The strategic implications of American air superiority achieved through aircraft like the F4U Corsair extended far beyond tactical aviation. Control of Pacific airspace enabled American submarine operations against Japanese shipping, strategic bombing of Japanese industrial targets, and amphibious operations that progressively reduced Japanese defensive perimeters. Each of these strategic capabilities depended fundamentally on air superiority achieved by fighter aircraft like the F4U Corsair. The 11-to-1 kill ratio compiled by Corsair pilots was thus not merely a measure of tactical effectiveness, but a foundation for strategic operations that ultimately determined the war's outcome in the Pacific theater. The post-war analysis of F4U Corsair operations provides insights into factors that contributed to its exceptional combat record. Military historians and aviation analysts have identified several key elements that combined to produce the aircraft's remarkable effectiveness against Japanese opposition. First among these factors was the systematic approach to tactical development that characterized American military operations during World War II. Combat reports from pilots like Kenneth Walsh were analyzed by training commands and incorporated into curricula for replacement pilots. Lessons learned in combat theaters were transmitted rapidly to training bases, ensuring that new pilots arrived with knowledge of effective techniques. This systematic approach contrasted sharply with Japanese training methods that emphasized individual initiative and spiritual preparation over technical analysis. While Japanese methods had produced exceptional individual pilots, they were less effective at transmitting tactical knowledge to large numbers of replacement aviators as the war progressed. Second was the superior industrial and logistical support that sustained American aviation operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. F4U Corsairs in combat theaters were maintained at optimal performance levels through regular supply of spare parts, replacement engines, and upgraded equipment. This logistical superiority enabled sustained operations at high tempo without performance degradation. Japanese aircraft, operating with increasingly limited logistical support, often suffered performance losses due to deferred maintenance and improvised repairs. These maintenance issues compounded the technological disadvantages of Japanese aircraft designs, creating cumulative effects that reduced combat effectiveness over time. Third was the comprehensive nature of American pilot training programs that produced aviators with extensive preparation in the specific aircraft they would fly operationally. American replacement pilots typically arrived in combat theaters with more than 300 hours of flight time and advanced training in gunnery, tactics, and instrument flying. Japanese replacement pilots, by contrast, often arrived with minimal flight time and limited training in combat techniques. The progressive shortening of Japanese training programs as operational demands increased created a qualitative gap that became more pronounced as the war continued. Fourth was the technological superiority of American aircraft designs that emphasized performance, firepower, and survivability over traditional measures of fighter capability. The F4U Corsair's powerful engine, heavy armament, and rugged construction provided performance advantages that could be exploited by properly trained pilots using appropriate tactics. Japanese aircraft designs that had proven effective in the war's early years became increasingly obsolete as combat conditions evolved. The light construction and limited armament that had characterized successful Japanese fighters proved inadequate against improved American aircraft and tactics. Fifth was the tactical innovation that enabled American pilots to exploit their aircraft's superior performance characteristics. Pilots like Kenneth Walsh developed energy management techniques that used altitude and speed advantages to dictate the terms of air combat, neutralizing traditional Japanese advantages in maneuverability and pilot skill. These tactical innovations were systematically developed, tested, and disseminated through American training programs, creating a continuous improvement process that enhanced combat effectiveness throughout the war. Japanese tactical development, hampered by resource constraints and organizational conservatism, failed to produce comparable innovations. The combination of these factors created cumulative advantages that explain the F4U Corsair's exceptional combat record. The 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Corsair pilots reflected not just superior individual aircraft performance, but comprehensive systematic advantages that characterized American military operations during World War II. The legacy of F4U Corsair operations in the Pacific War extended far beyond the immediate tactical success achieved during World War II. The aircraft's combat record provided validation for design approaches and operational concepts that influenced American military aviation development for decades following the war's conclusion. The emphasis on performance and survivability that characterized the Corsair's design became standard for subsequent American fighter aircraft. Post-war designs like the F-86 Sabre, F-100 Super Sabre, and F-4 Phantom incorporated lessons learned from Corsair operations about the importance of speed, firepower, and pilot protection in air combat. The tactical innovations developed by Corsair pilots established principles of energy management and systematic approach to air combat that remained fundamental elements of American fighter training through the jet age. Modern air combat systems trace their conceptual origins to techniques developed by pilots like Kenneth Walsh during the Pacific Campaign. The systematic approach to training and tactical development demonstrated during Corsair operations became the model for American military aviation education. The continuous improvement process that transformed early combat disasters like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre into later successes like Walsh's Medal of Honor actions established patterns that characterized American military training throughout the Cold War era. The industrial and logistical systems that supported Corsair operations provided the foundation for American military aviation's post-war expansion. The production techniques, supply chain management, and maintenance procedures developed during wartime operations were adapted for peacetime military aviation and eventually for commercial aircraft manufacturing. Perhaps most importantly, the F4U Corsair's combat record demonstrated that technological innovation combined with systematic training and tactical development could overcome traditional military advantages based on experience and individual skill. This lesson influenced American military doctrine and procurement decisions throughout the Cold War, establishing technology and systematic preparation as fundamental elements of military superiority. The 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by F4U Corsair pilots thus represents more than exceptional tactical success in a specific historical context. It demonstrates the effectiveness of comprehensive systematic approaches to military aviation that combine technological innovation, systematic training, tactical development, and logistical support to achieve decisive operational advantages. These lessons remain relevant for contemporary military aviation, where technological capability must be combined with appropriate training, tactics, and support systems to achieve operational effectiveness. The F4U Corsair's Pacific War record provides a historical example of how systematic approaches to military aviation can produce exceptional results when properly implemented and sustained. The story of the F4U Corsair in the Pacific War is ultimately the story of American military aviation's transformation from defensive operations characterized by improvisation and individual heroism to offensive operations based on systematic preparation and technological superiority. Kenneth Walsh's evolution from struggling novice to Medal of Honor recipient exemplifies this broader transformation that determined the outcome of the Pacific Air War. The 11-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Corsair pilots stands as testimony to the effectiveness of this transformation and its decisive impact on the course of World War II in the Pacific theater. The aircraft and pilots who had struggled to survive their first encounters with experienced Japanese opposition evolved into the dominant force in Pacific skies, achieving air superiority that enabled American strategic success in the world's largest military theater. From Henderson Field to Okinawa, from the desperate days of early 1943 to the overwhelming superiority of 1945, the F4U Corsair and its pilots wrote a chapter in military aviation history that demonstrates the decisive impact of systematic innovation in warfare. Their record remains unmatched in the annals of air combat, a permanent testament to American industrial capacity, pilot training, and tactical innovation that transformed the balance of power in the Pacific War.